Welcome back to our continuing dissection, in a sense, and diving into the Gospel of Matthew. We are Matthew chapter 27, and I'm going to read verses 1 and 2, and I will be using the Williams translation, which is the New Testament in the language of the people. Matthew chapter 27 and verses 1 and 2. As soon as day broke, all the high priests and elders held a consultation against Jesus to put him to death. So they bound him, led him away, and turned him over to Pilate, the governor. The key phrase in this passage is the time marker. In an earlier reading, we said that there were scholars who looked to reconstruct the events of Jesus's trial in front of Jewish authorities in light of what knowledge we do have about Jewish jurisprudence. And I kind of made the point that while this has some validity, the one problem in all of this is that we should not assume and presume that the trial of Jesus in front of Caiaphas and what we presume is the Sanhedrin, or a chunk of it, is in any sense legitimate. And when we read the time marker here, we get the sense that this was not designed to be a proper trial. It was a show trial, and like any show trial, it was a process designed to produce a predetermined end. So it was, well, according to Williams, it says what? As soon as the day broke. In other words, they were doing this through the evening. And understand that they had a time pressure. It was going to be Passover soon. They had a festival to prepare. They had religious values to uphold. They had to get Jesus out of the way so it would not wreck their performance of Passover. A word that can be overused in group settings is the idea of consensus. In the church, this can be confused with the idea of unity. And here I want us to be very clear that there are two words, and obviously we could play exactly into what their meanings are. But what I'm getting at is there's two ideas at work here that are used in the life of the church, and if we do not keep them straight, we can get confused as what is their meaning and whether they are good or bad. These two words are consensus and unity. These two terms are similar, but in the church carry very different senses. Consensus is where you have a coming together on an issue. This is not necessarily something positive or good. And I would say that ultimately consensus in the churches usually tends to range to the more negative side. Consensus in the life of the church can be anti-faith and destructive of true godliness. Go back to the trial that Jesus was in before Caiaphas that was done during the night so they could get things over with, so they could get on with the important thing in their life, which was getting ready for a religious festival. That trial produced consensus. Unity, in a sense, is the more Christian term. Unity is rooted and grounded in a faith experience. In other words, you cannot have unity with a person who does not operate out of the realm of Christian faith. And that means a person who actually is living in faith, not a person who calls himself a Christian or a person who attends a church, because unity in that sense is a faith-driven, faith-based experience. And so what you will find as you walk with Christ and as a Christian is that you will have unity with people who may be very different from you because of your faith in Jesus Christ. Unity in the life of the church does not always equate to consensus. In fact, consensus in the church is often at the expense of unity. The trial of Jesus at night was not about unity, it was about consensus. It was politics at its worst. Now, how many were there at that meeting? How many were there in that group who represented the various religious factions of Judaism that night? We will never actually be able to answer that question. What we know is that there were different factions in the Judaism of the day. The council that met in Caiaphas were never going to be unified because there were sharp and deep divisions between these various factions of Judaism that day. The council that met in Caiaphas were not after unity. Caiaphas knew he was not free. And the backstory is this: Caiaphas knew he was not free to do what he wanted. And in a sense, Caiaphas was also operating out of the fact that he did not want blood on his hands. So you make it a committee meeting requirement that Jesus be crucified. You make it in that sense, a consensus of a number of people representing different factions of Judaism. He knew that in order to deal with Jesus, he needed the support of the other factions in Judaism. The perversity of this situation is that in rejecting the unity that Jesus came to bring, these men found consensus where normally none was to be had. Do you get that? These were groups that had friction between each other. They were factions. They did not agree. But in their rejection of Jesus, found consensus, not unity. If you are going to be true to the faith and walk by faith, you will find it will create sparks. In the life of the church, this can be the case. You see, consensus speaks of how a majority have come together on an issue. Too often, consensus in the church comes not on issues of faith and commitment, but against the faith and commitment. The paradox of the life of faith is that you will have unity with people of faith, even if within the church you lack consensus. You see, Jesus might have been outnumbered on that council or in that council, but that did not mean Jesus was wrong. It can be discouraging in the life of faith and in the life of the church to realize that one can be right and be at odds with the church. But that, again, is a difference between consensus and unity. And if it happened to Jesus that Jesus was rejected by the Judaism of his day and the various factions within the Judaism of that day, if Jesus could not, as it were, be recognized and have unity about who and what he was, but rather through consensus there was rejection, do not be surprised. Do not be surprised if you, his or her disciple, will find you outside the consensus of the church as you seek to walk in faith.